Welcome back to another VBA tutorial. So we're wrapping up our discussion on web scraping with VBA. Well, I guess I shouldn't say wrap up. I mean, if people suggest other content, I'm open to doing it. But as of for now, there's no upcoming content on the topic. We saw in previous videos how to parse a web page using the VBA object library. So using the Internet Explorer object library, the HTML document object library, getting things like the links, the text, images, just a lot of different types of things. I'm going to move on to another topic. It was requested by somebody who follows the channel, tables. Yes, working with tables inside of an HTML page. And so, just a heads up, I am assuming that you've watched the other videos. I'm not going to be going over pretty much any of this stuff in pretty deep detail. It's just going to be high level overview. So, again, just assuming that you've watched the other videos. So, what are we going to be scraping? Well, I'm a big Star Wars fan, and I thought, well, why not scrape a table on the Star Wars Wikipedia page? In fact, we'll scrape this table, the one that has all the movies and the release date, the directors, screenwriters, story by, and producers. So, again, huge Star Wars fan. Very excited the last couple days because we got some news on episode 9. We got the new Mandalorian series trailer. We are going to be getting an Obi-Wan series and supposedly a Darth Maul series. So a lot of good stuff if you're a Star Wars fan. I'm kind of biased towards the Age of Republic trilogy. I was introduced to episode 2, God, long time ago. My brother took me, and I think it was my brother and my sister. But yeah, I was just like fascinated with lightsabers, and I thought Mace Windu was like the coolest guy on the planet. I'm like, dude, this guy's got a purple lightsaber. Like, how cool do you have to be in order to get a purple lightsaber? I was like, I want that one. But alas, enough about Star Wars. So the goal is to scrape this table. The reason I chose this table in particular is it's a messy table. I mean, it's not like messy, but the code is kind of messy. So you have certain situations where like a cell spans multiple columns or like a cell spans multiple rows, things along that nature. So in those type of situations, we do have to treat it differently. And you'll see my code is going to have a lot of if statements and for loops just to handle a situation like this. But really, when we think about a table, obviously this is the table itself. Each table has multiple rows, and then those rows are made up of individual cells. And so the cells obviously can either span multiple columns or multiple rows. And so the goal is to take this and put it into an Excel workbook like this over here. So, going to be really cool. I think it's going to be pretty useful. And then also, just to kind of clarify, when I say like we're going to put it, so like technically George Lucas would be in all 3 of these cells. So we're going to basically like kind of like unmerge the cells in a sense. So with that being said, let's jump into our VBA editor. Again, all this is doing importing our Internet Explorer object, creating a new instance, making sure it's visible. We're going to navigate to our Wiki Star Wars URL. This is just making sure that we wait for the page to load before we actually move on to the next component. It prints out the URL. Here we're just creating a IE document, so like an HTML document object, and then we're going to take the HTML code that is in our Internet Explorer object and store it in that document object. And so just so you're aware, you are going to need the Microsoft HTML object library and the Microsoft Internet Controls library. Just an FYI. Alrighty. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to declare some of our table objects and their components. Won't necessarily use all of them. No, I think I am using all of this in this video. When I was experimenting, I had some I wasn't actually using. But first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do IE tables. This is going to be an HTML element collection, so a collection of multiple HTML objects. And then we're going to have IE table. This is going to be an HTML table, so this is a particular table object. And then we're going to have an IE row, so this is going to be a particular row inside that particular table. And then finally, we're going to have an IE cell, which is going to be an HTML table cell. And that's going to be an individual cell in that row. Okay, so now that we've done that, just to kind of show you how to get all the tables in a particular page, it's pretty straightforward for the most part, but all you do is we first can grab all the tables in our document, and so set IE tables equal to IE document get elements by tag name, and the tag name for a table is table. And then from here, if I wanted to, I can see how many tables are in my document. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna print that out for you guys so you can see it. Okay. So it opens it up, does all that stuff. It's 35 tables. A lot of tables. A lot of tables. Really, we're not gonna be working with all the tables. We're gonna be working with the second table. So really what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab the second table in our document, and it's really easy to access it. All you got to do is put another curvy bracket and then 1. We're 0 base, so 0, 1. That's the second table. And then once you've done that, I'm going to change that from a tables collection to a table object. Very important you change that, otherwise you won't have access to certain properties. And then from here, you can do things like, hey, how many rows do we have in our table? And then you might want to be, what is it? Some of them don't all work, and I'm not entirely sure which ones do or not. I think data page size. I don't know if that returns anything or not. But this will just, return some information about our table. Nothing like super fancy, because there's really not a lot here. So it says there's 20 rows, and then apparently a data page size of 0. So I'd have to look exactly what that means in the VBA documentation. But, there you go. Okay, so from here, fun stuff. First thing we're going to do, well, we got to initialize a row count. Why am I doing this? Well, we're going to have to loop through each row in our particular table. And so it'll kind of make sense when you see it. Now, technically, I don't have to do this, but I've been super cautious because I'm running into situations where sometimes it works on one table and it doesn't work on another table. So I am just doing what I consider like a failsafe for multiple different types of tables. So even though it might not be necessarily useful in this table, you still might want to keep it because a different table, it might not work. So this initializer is going to be really used so that way we don't exceed the number of rows in our tables. That's really all it's going to do. And it will make more sense once you kind of see where potentially things can go wrong. That's what I call it. It's the things that can go wrong. So that's going to handle that. I'm also going to want some information about my tables too, again, just for some fail-safe protection. Determine the number of rows in our table. And really, that's the maximum number of rows. And so we'll say max rows equal IE table rows dot length. So this is going to make sure we never exceed the number of rows in our particular table. I can also do max columns. This is IE table. I'll save that for another one. I'm still going to add it, but I'm going to add it somewhere else. So if I want to, I can loop through each table. Loop through each row. So loop through each row, and we're going to say for each IE row in IE table dot rows, go to the next one, and then here's where IntelliSense likes to lie to us. So you will go down here. You see how there's no inner text? There is definitely an inner text. So this will work. IntelliSense will tell you that it can't work, or it doesn't hint at that it can work, but it can work. So if I run this, it will print all the text inside of our cells. See how it's doing it? So even though IntelliSense is saying, hey, you can't do that, you can definitely do that. You just have to be aware that IntelliSense is lying to you a little bit. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to loop through each row. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to determine the maximum number of columns in our table. In this case, we can just reference row 1. So determine the maximum number of columns in our table. This will make a little bit more sense when we get to row spanned. Equals 1. So I just want the first row, end if, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say max columns equals IE row. I'm going to grab the cells collection and I'm going to grab the length of it. And so if I go on the first row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we're going to only have 6 columns. That's what I want it to be. So now that we've done that, we're going to initialize a new incrementer, but this time it's for the column counts. So initialize an incrementer for the column count. And so we'll call it column count equals 1. Okay, and then from here, you want to loop through each cell in the row. So again, visually, go on each row, go to this cell, then 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 this cell. Then go to the next row, go to this cell, then this cell, then this cell. So we're going to say for each IE cell in IE row cells, what I'm going to do is, just so you guys can see it, debug print IE cell. Again, IntelliSense is going to lie to you and say that you can't do it, but you can do it. And just print that cell. Oh, no. Why is it doing that? Okay. And so this should show us each cell value. Perfect. Pretty cool so far. So we can see that it's getting each cell value and everything like that. That's awesome. Sorry about that. I jumped to the wrong thing. So now that we're looping through each cell, we've got to ask a question for each cell in our table. And the first question we got to ask is, does this cell span multiple columns? So if I hover over this cell, you will see that there's no property called column spanned or row spanned. The first question we're going to ask for each cell is whether it has a column span property. And if it does it exceed 1? If it does exceed 1, we need to treat that particular cell differently. So for example, this one right here that has George Lucas, that spans 3 columns. So that means technically in my Excel workbook, I want this cell, and this cell to all have George Lucas inside of it. And so how we handle that is we're going to add an if statement that first checks the column span property to see if it exceeds 1. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say if IE cell column span is greater than 1, then and then else end if. So that's the first condition we're going to check for. So check if the cell spans multiple columns. If it does, then treat it differently. Otherwise, treat it like a normal cell for the most part. There's a catch. All right. Well, if it does span multiple columns, what do we do? Well, all we need to do is we just need to span, or basically just need to loop a couple extra times. So really, all we're going to do is we're going to say for I equals 1 to IE cell column spanned, and then, where is it? And then next. Now, there's kind of a catch. So that works fine for all these ones right here. This one, not so much. If you can kind of see there, it says column span is 7. I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit. Well, remember how the maximum number of columns is 6? So here we've got a problem because column span is going to loop 7 times when I want it to loop 6 times. So we're going to build in basically kind of like a failsafe, which is going to say application dot worksheet function, and we're going to call the min function. And we're going to say take the minimum of the column span or the maximum columns. So in the situation where column span is 7, we're going to have two options, 7 or 6. In this case, the min function is going to return 6, which I want it to. So basically, span the number of columns that you need to span. And then the next thing we got to check for is if it spans multiple rows. So loop the number of cells that it spans. And dump the same value. Then check if it spans multiple rows. Because obviously it would be simple if it did. Okay, so now that we did that, we need to say, okay, now check if that particular cell spans multiple rows. Well, all that means is if the row span property is greater than 1, do something, otherwise do something else. If it doesn't, then leave it be. Then treat it like normal. Okay, well, if it does span multiple rows, what's the next potential problem that we can run into? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say for j equals row count to row count plus IE cell dot row span minus 1, because we want to go kind of one less. Sorry, I'm going to take a drink really quick. It's hot out here and his throat's getting all dry. So loop that many times. And then the first thing we got to make sure is we always want to stop if the row count exceeds the number of rows in our particular table. So if j is less than or equal to max rows, then do something. Now, technically, I've been able to remove this with certain tables and it works fine, but there was one particular table where it caused all sorts of issues when I removed this section. So in some cases, I would almost say if you're going to check to see what to remove first, this seems to be the most logical part, but I can't guarantee it to you. So it's kind of one of those things, just keep it in there. I think it's better to have it in there than not have it in there, but you know, I think that's for probably rare situations. So we'll say this workbook dot worksheets. We're going to go to the table extract sheet. We're going to go to the cells J and then column count. We want the value of that cell to equal the IE cell that we're on, the inner text. So keep in mind, J is going to change, and it's just going to be the row that we're currently on, and then the column count is going to be the column that we're currently on. So if we're on the first column, it's going to be the first column in our Excel worksheet. If it's on the second row in our loop, it's going to be the second row in our worksheet. So that's that situation. So this is a situation where it spans multiple rows. Again, that's the first thing that we run into. So then populate the number of rows. Just make sure to not exceed the number of rows in the table. Again, keep it in there, rather be safer than sorry. And sorry if I'm pausing a little bit, but there's a lot of notes and it was way too big a font, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh my God, I should have made it normal. It's too big. It's like spanning all these lines. Okay, so now we're gonna go into the part where if it doesn't span multiple rows, okay, what are we gonna do next? Well, the first thing you gotta check is the cell blank? If it's not blank, then just dump the cell. And then if it's not, then potentially there's other things. Now for this part, I didn't add another failsafe. You could technically be fine, I think, in this situation. You might have to add another condition here, but I haven't run into it yet, so I can't say with 100% confidence, but I'll kind of show you at a later point what it is. So dump the data as long as it's empty. So if, and I'm just gonna copy this guy just to kind of save some time and not have to type a bunch of stuff, Okay, if, and then I want this to be the row count. Keep in mind, up here it was fine because it was in that loop, but I got to change this to a row count. So, no. Then do something, and if. So again, really simple stuff for the most part. I'm just dumping the data into the workbook. And all I've checked for at this point is, okay, if it spans multiple cells, loop the number of columns that it needs to span, and then check again if it spans multiple rows, because then you got to change that a little bit differently. So that's all I'm doing. And then pretty much that is that one. I just want to make sure again that I'm not doing it. Okay, and if next, okay. And then from here, go to the next column. Now, I'm going to do my best on the next one to kind of not confuse people, but I might just copy the code at some point and kind of just show it to you because I think it might be a little bit easier. But I'm going to try to write it out first just to make sure. So we've checked the situation where it spans multiple columns. Now we're going to check the situation where it doesn't span multiple columns. But again, it could span multiple rows. So if it spans multiple rows, then treat it differently. Again, kind of just how I like to think about it, i.e. cell. If the row span property is greater than 1, then we got to do something different. So then else, and then end if. Okay, so what do we do? Well, if it spans multiple rows, then populate the number of rows. Just make sure not to exceed it. And so what we're going to say is for I equals row count to row count plus IE cell dot row spanned minus 1. And then we're going to say next, and then we've got to check again because potentially it might happen where we exceed the number of rows. If I is less than or equal to max rows, then end if. Okay. Ew. Wait a minute. Yes, okay, so this is where things get kind of messy, so bear with me a little bit. They always like to get messy. So I'm going to copy this. How did I write that? Sorry, like looking at this code sometimes like just makes me confused. But it works. I know it works. Okay, so here, if it does, then we want to make sure that is I. That is I. But here's the other situation. So if it's not blank, what are you going to do in that situation? Well, in that situation, you just want to go to the column after it. So all we're going to do is I'm going to tab in, and I'm going to say column count plus 1. So if the cell that you're currently on when you're iterating through the columns, if it's not blank, then go to the column after it. That's what this is doing. And then, what else is this? Yeah. Oh, okay, and then I think this one actually, end if next, and then else. Okay, perfect. See, this is like the one thing I hate about this code. It's like there's just so many if statements. It's so easy to get lost. Dump data as long as it's empty. If not, go to the column after it. Loop the number of rows you need to. Just make sure not to exceed the number of rows in the table. That's all. I'll put this down here just so that way it's a little bit, I guess, easier to read. Okay, so we'll go here. Okay, so if that's not the case, oh shoot. If that's not the case, what are we going to do next? Well, in that situation, we can basically take this guy, but we're going to change it again just a tiny bit. And we're going to say, take that, and I'm going to tab this out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to row count, and then row count. And so Okay, so if it doesn't span multiple columns, check and see if it spans multiple rows. If it does, make sure not to exceed the number of rows, but otherwise just kind of loop the number of rows you need to. Then check to make sure the cell is blank. If it's not blank, then go to the column after it. If it doesn't span multiple rows, check to see if the cell is blank. If it is blank, just dump the data in there. If it's not blank, then go to the column after it. And then from here, what you can do is you want to make sure you go to the next column. So go to the next column, and we're going to say column count equals column count plus 1. And then go to the next row. So go to the next row. So row count equals row count plus 1. I'm sure I confused a lot of people. But again, just high level, what are you doing? You're going to loop through each row. You're then going to loop through each cell in that row. The first thing you're going to check for, does my column span multiple columns? Does my cell span multiple columns? If it does, then check if it spans multiple rows. If it doesn't, still check and see if it spans multiple rows. In either case that it spans multiple rows, basically loop the number of rows that you need to, but then make sure not to exceed the number of rows in your table. It's really only going to be an issue if potentially you got to the end of your table. Otherwise, just dump the data as normal as long as the cell is blank. If it's not blank, then go to the column after it. That's really all this is doing. It looks a little confusing, but you're just checking to make sure that things are empty or not empty, and so on and so on. So I'm going to run this. No guarantee it's going to work the first time. I mean, sometimes I surprise myself, but did it work? It worked. Never works. It never works. But as you can see, it did exactly what we wanted it to do. So it made sure we've got our header. We have the situation where we're kind of breaking it into each section. We now have each column. We made sure that it's spanning the number of rows. So that's really what this is doing. This is making sure that if it needs to span, it spans, and it goes down, it populates. That's what all those conditions are checking for. It's making sure that if it needs to span, it spans. So I'll kind of show you what can happen if I take out certain conditions, because sometimes that kind of just drives home the concept a little bit more. But for example, say I took out this condition right here, right? What do you think would happen? Well, now you potentially could go more than 6 columns, which you don't want to do. Voila! So that was there in those sections. So that exceeded the number of sections that the number of columns we needed to go. So that's what that one was causing. And then we put that back. This one, technically, if I leave it, if I remove this little if that, it's still going to look the same. That was for a different table. I would still leave it, but you can kind of see what's going on there. And then potentially, if you didn't have these column span checks, that's where you could have other situations. I really don't want to do it. I guess I could try to comment this out and see what happens. Oof, it scares me when I do that. It really does. It scares me so much. But you can see here, it's not spanning the number of columns that it needs to span. And see, it's like got all this stuff that's messed up, and it's just not pretty. Oh, geez. Oh, I didn't want to do that. So that kind of shows you why we need to have those column spans in there, or otherwise it's just not going to come out right. You got to make sure you have that in there. Just like with the row spans. Like, so again, if I kind of like had taken this section out, it's not going to span multiple rows, and you'd have these situations where, you know, it's just going to kind of treat it as is. So a lot of stuff where potentially can go wrong, but if you take this code and you kind of look at it probably on your own, it'll make a lot more sense, I think, of how it's working. But ideally what it's going to do is it's going to make that table in what I would call is the proper format. And now I have like 5 of these things open, which I don't need. It's going to make it like this. Now I cheated a little bit in the sense of I bolded these lines, but that was just so you guys can see it. I mean, you could do some formatting stuff too. Like, I'm a big fan of, like, if you're going to do it, 18 is the way to go. Just like that. And then you can do your little, like, you can do your little sections right here, and you can, fill it and all that kind of fun stuff, right? It's always about the coloring, right? But yeah, so that's how you go out and parse a table. A lot of conditions you got to check for, but again, I think this kind of does a better job than Power Query sometimes, because Power Query gets you some weird stuff when you try to parse tables, and it doesn't necessarily work all the time. So if you have any questions about parsing HTML tables using VBA, please make sure to put them down in the comments below. I'm sure that might confuse some people looking at that code, but hopefully I tried to make sense out of it. Also, if you could, please make sure to like the video. We always appreciate the support. And if you're not already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos. So thank you again for watching, everybody. We're going to see you in the next video.